Car, why you no drive fast? Now you drive fast. This was an actual magazine spread for Driver San Francisco, in case you wanted to remember the memes we were dealing with at the time. It's amazing. More amazing than when they were marketing Driver 3 with the tagline, good, bad, both, describing that game to a T. I've spent the last few years doing these retrospectives on driver games, so let me bring you up to speed. We had Driver 1 and 2 on the PS1, which were genuinely groundbreaking open-world driving games inspired by old Hollywood car chase films. Driver 3 in 2004 had a lot of hype and marketing behind it because the first two were so big, but it's widely considered an unfinished mess and a massive letdown, as much as I don't want to admit it, and so Driver Parallel Lines followed it up in 2006 with far less fanfare and played it far safer, winding up as a solid game that didn't set the world on fire. Atari then sold the IP and the developer to Ubisoft, which brings us to 2011's Driver San Francisco. It had been 5 years since the last game, which was a long break back then. Driver had a new publisher, a bit of a tarnished reputation, and a new generation of consoles to land on. I remember watching a developer preview for Driver San Francisco before it came out on my Gen 3 iPod Touch, which we all know saw its fair share of awful why you know memes, and I was definitely that one nerdy superfan stereotype, arms folded in the corner of the room just scoffing about how this driver game isn't a true driver game. It's immediately clear that San Francisco is a complete departure from the driver games before it. Like, Gorn is the self-serious, hard-boiled thing in favor of a bouncy, quippy buddy cop send-up.
Let's grab a cup of coffee. There's something I need to talk to you about.
You're not pregnant again, are you?
In that preview, series director Martin Edmondson kept saying that San Francisco is all about taking Driver back to its roots. The series had lost its sense of identity to some degree, so bringing things back to their roots was a good thing to hear, but the gameplay footage just wasn't lining up with the words I was hearing.
Bang! Right, so that looks like the end of Tanner's chase. Now, whilst Jericho gets away here, I want to show you this. This is a brand new feature for Driver San Francisco. We call it Shift.
So this is the shift feature where you can press a face button at almost any time to have an out-of-body experience, fly above your car, choose another car, and take control of the driver. It's a lot to take in, I know. Upon seeing this, my young, close-minded self folded my arms even harder and decided against buying the game on release. Curiosity did get the better of me, and lo and behold, like most nerdy superfan types, I was way too quick to judge because the shift mechanic is pure magic. It's so much fun, it's snappy and it feels great control-wise, and it's not just some side thing, it's sort of at the very core of what this game is. Many missions are designed around your seemingly supernatural ability to shift between cars, and you can draw parallels here to the portal gun in Portal, or more recently the photography into reality thing that Viewfinder does. Like, puzzle games that have a singular mechanical centerpiece that dictates how you interact with their worlds. Now, Driver San Francisco is nowhere near as cerebral as Portal, but its shift mechanic rewires how you'd normally think about the open world driving game in a similar way. It has those puzzle gamey light bulb moments in ways that a more conventional driving game couldn't. For example, say you're given a mission to come both first and second in a street race, like kind of a fun concept where you can switch between your drivers, but you're not allowed to shift into opponent races. Instinctively, you'll shift between your two drivers and do your best to race to the finish, and that's fun in and of itself, but think a little outside of the box and maybe you can shift into oncoming traffic and try to head-on collide with your opponents to take them out, or take it a step further and drop your two racers way behind, making it easier to collide only with your opponents while they're ahead. Maybe you could fly ahead with one racer and use the other to ram your opponents off the road, or if you're well ahead, you could finish the race early by blocking the road and cutting your opponents off with a semi-trailer or something. What was a conventional-ish race transforms into something far more dynamic. Like, you could just play it normally, but if you're not a racing fiend, then shifting around smashing cars is a blast too, and so many missions are like this. Like, I remember one asked me to defuse bombs in 10 trucks around the map, and I remember thinking how hard it was going to be to drive over to all of those trucks, until I remembered that, I can just shift out and fly over to them. For a high-profile, big-budget, big-publisher video game, to make a mechanic like this its focal point is ambitious and risky in a way you don't see very often. For the developer Reflections Interactive to pull it all off this well is a testament to their boldness and talent. It's such a liberating feeling being able to hop into basically any car you want. Like, there's something jovial about seeing a Ford GT driving past only to fly into its driver's seat and take it for a spin. Even just using the shift feature to zoom out, fly around, and pick missions out feels really intuitive. But I don't think the shift system alone is why Driver San Francisco is such a widely beloved game, and it is a very beloved game. Like, I did a YouTube community poll asking which driver game is the best, and about 50% of voters said San Francisco, which I think says a lot, especially when you consider that my audience should be predisposed towards liking the earlier games. Driver 3 was robbed right in front of me. The shift system is the first and often the only thing that people bring up when talking about this game, and fair enough, but everything that it does surrounding the shift system is also super impressive, even if it's not as showy.
What if I am losing it, Jones? What if this is all in my head?
The in-universe justification for our protagonist, Detective John Tanner, having magical superpowers is that he's in a coma, and all of this is a hallucination, as great as it would be if he was blessed by a space god or something. Now that would be a heel turn for the series. Weirdly, this is a different coma from the one that he may or may not have ended Driver 3 in, which is awfully confusing considering Driver 3 was his last appearance in the series before this, but no, he's in a car crash at the start of San Francisco, and you play the majority of the rest of the game in his head. As a player, you're always aware that it's a dream. I imagine it must have been tempting in the writer's room to do a big "and it was all a dream" reveal at the end, but they didn't do that. They cut in plenty of shots of Tanner in the hospital bed throughout to make sure that you know that this is indeed all a dream sequence, and it's smart that they made the conscious decision to do so. No pun intended. Because you know this game is mostly a dream, it can walk and talk like it's doing fourth wall breaks all the time without actually fully breaking the fourth wall. Stay with me here.
Focus! Focus! There! Okay. Ah! Ah! Well, I'm not dead, and I'm not me.
Tanner is now more of a slightly gruffer Nathan Drake. He's a quippy, talkative type, and so when he first starts shifting, he does the whole "what is happening to me" talk to himself, and then you have this fun sequence convincing his partner Jones that you have superpowers, where Tanner tells him what stunt a nearby car is about to do before you shift in and do it. And because when you shift into cars, you actually shift into their drivers' bodies, the writers had a lot of fun with and got a lot of mileage out of that as a comedy bit.
Ready to put the car in carnage?
Do you know something I don't?
Just keep your camera rolling, Jeff.
It's Jack.
It's not always laugh out loud humor, but it's always at least slight exhale tier of humor, and Tanner's approach to this crazy situation is always underpinned by his attitude of just having fun with it. You sort of quickly enter this comfy rhythm of shifting into a car, hearing a fun dialogue bit, some upbeat licensed rock tunes are usually playing, and you're completing whatever objective you have. It's very jovial and very charming, and I think a big reason it is so is because it's all in a dream. As much as I love the idea of a laughing, maniacal Tanner shifting into real people's bodies in the real world, just killing and traumatizing them in car crashes all day, maybe that is what this game should have been, I think that having everything happen in a dream brings with it a necessary and deep unseriousness that serves as the baseline for San Francisco's tone. It immediately communicates to you that you shouldn't take any of this seriously, but treat it as more of a playground without consequences. With the shift mechanic, and for the first time in this series, licensed cars, it has this toy box Hot Wheels-like quality where there's so much joy in just grabbing cars, going on joyrides, and smashing them into things. I wish it had damage models as good as Driver 3's, but I imagine the car manufacturers wouldn't have had any of that. This lighthearted dream concept harmonizes perfectly with the humor and the tone, and even the side mission-filled, upgrade-filled, video gamey structure is hand-waved by it being dream logic, as is Tanner's flippant attitude. In the handful of scenes in the real world, Tanner is a lot more serious of a character, which lines up. So what I mean by Driver San Francisco breaking the fourth wall, but not actually breaking the fourth wall is, Tanner will always be commenting on things happening to him as if he's aware he's in a video game. His dream is kind of treated as this big framed internal metafiction. The writers use the dream as a storytelling device with techniques that mirror what you'd see in your typical quippy fourth wall breaks, but Tanner is simply commenting on the dream he's having rather than the video game he's in, and that key distinction allows for a sincerity to the story and tone that it wouldn't otherwise have. It doesn't indulge in the typical postmodern, cynical, or flippant tendencies that your usual turn-to-camera protagonist would have, and Driver San Francisco can remain committed to its ideals without shying away from its playful, metafiction-y stylings. The overarching story, like Driver 3, is about tracking and chasing down the prolific criminal Jericho, who this time around is very much a chaotic Joker-like arch-rival. He even looks like Jack Nicholson, which is very on the nose. And because the game is mostly in a dream, the logic is that Tanner is listening to the news on a hospital TV while he's in his coma and interpreting it in his dream as a way to piece together evidence and figure out how to catch Jericho in the real world. You're made aware pretty early on that this is what's going on, which again is clever because it adds intrigue and weight to an otherwise inherently trivial setting. Ultimately, that was all a very long-winded way of saying Driver San Francisco's tone is charming and playful in ways that feel effortless. It all clicks together properly. It's never awkward or unnatural in ways that comedy in video games can be, and it's the kind of game that just makes you smile. I'm tempted to say the words ludo-narrative harmony, but my god, I already regret it. While playing the game, you aren't consciously thinking about how it's achieving its tone. It's more something that you feel and enjoy in the background while you're noodling around smashing Crown Vics into Dodge Vipers. The whole dream thing is also used as a vehicle for some surrealism, or at least further surrealism on top of the whole shifting into other cars thing. As the story really starts to crescendo when you're close to catching Dream Jericho, there's some glitch in the Matrix style subversions that are pulled. One of my favorites is when it's revealed that Jericho can also shift, so he starts launching oncoming traffic into you, just like you've been doing to everyone for the whole game. It's a real rush, and it's a fantastic raising of the stakes. The internet loves to bring up this one moment, and justifiably so, where you shift into the eyes of a driver chasing Tanner while you're still in control of Tanner. So you're controlling the car in front, and this moment is often brought up as an example of the second-person perspective in games. It's genuinely novel and genuinely surreal, and so unexpected for a silly open-world driving game. Also, I should mention that this is the first driver game to have a cockpit view, and it's really well done. If I had one criticism here, it's that I wish Driver San Francisco did more of this surrealism stuff. It sort of feels like it's all over before it truly goes off the walls with it. It's an easy thing to forgive though because, and thank you by the way for letting me indulge in just heaping praise on this game for so long now, but if you stripped away everything in Driver San Francisco aside from the driving model itself is fantastic on its own. The sense of speed is great, and the crashes feel great, and the drifting feels right. The cars are weighty as you drag their back wheels around corners, leaving smoke and tire trails behind. That drifty driver DNA is still here, but unlike prior driver games, it's more arcadey in the sense that the physics are more artificial, and the cars are more glued to the ground and harder to flip. You also now have this coma-induced stamina bar that you can upgrade and use to boost and ram cars. The emphasis here has been taken away from stunt driving and shifted more towards, thank you, I'm here all week, a more Burnout style, focused on arcade racing and taking down opponents. So, naturally, the racing here is the best it's ever been in the franchise, which, granted, is a low bar to clear. You know, it was fine in Parallel Lines. Parallel Lines itself was fine, but the racing here is fast and visceral. There's plenty of racing events, and the off-road racing especially is shockingly good as you're sort of constantly on the verge of losing control. It kind of reminds me of late 90s, early 2000s arcade rally races like Sega Rally or V-Rally or Rally Sport Challenge. Rally. It's simple sliding around the dirt fun. The funny thing about the shift mechanic, as unique and as cool as it is, it does begin to get a bit tired towards the end of the game. Eventually it does devolve into just constantly shifting up the road into an oncoming car so you can smash into an opponent over and over again. And by the time you've played through this game a good half dozen times over the last decade, what kind of nutjob would do such a thing, the novelty of the shift system does fade away. There's one story mission in particular that stands out in my mind, where you've just got to protect an area from incoming cars that is just especially dull. You're kind of just mindlessly shifting and smashing for what feels like way too long. And so, thank God playing the game like a conventional action driving game is so enjoyable. So often you can just choose not to shift, and that's still a valid way to play. Some missions actually don't let you shift, and it says something about how good the driving is that those missions are some of my favorites. The multiplayer is a blast too, with split screen and online and plenty of solid party game style modes. The servers were shut down in 2022 because, of course they were, but thankfully there's a custom server mod called Alcatraz that already has it back up and running. I'll link it somewhere. Now, just to pump the brakes for a second, there's a handful of ways that Driver San Francisco doesn't quite hit the mark that I think need mentioning. For one, and you might disagree with me on this, it's kind of ugly. The heads-up display is a bit gaudy, the colors are washed out, and this depiction of San Francisco is visually pretty bland. Like, maybe this was the cost of hitting 60 frames a second on consoles, which is great, but every area sort of has the same dull, yellow, hazy vibe to it, where San Francisco's real-life beauty isn't exactly captured. I'd argue that Driver 3's cities look better, even considering the technical differences, but then again, Driver 3 ran at like 20 frames a second on PS2 half the time and had visual glitches everywhere, so The fun licensed soundtrack of rock, soul, and electronic music is doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to creating atmosphere, as does Mark Canham's original score, which is very good too, as you'd expect from him, having worked on previous Driver games. He really hit the exact right vibe here.
Damn, I was an asshole.
We can argue about who is the bigger asshole after we catch that bastard.
There's these movie token pickups scattered around that you need to find to unlock some of the best side missions in the game, and doing so is incredibly tedious. Also, the game is broadly super easy, which might be my biggest issue with it. Outside of some side content, the challenge is mostly trivial, and while I don't necessarily wish this was Driver 2 Chase the Gunman levels of difficult because I'd rather not pull my hair out, I think for such a precise and skill-based driving model, to not have much of an avenue to test your skills out, at least in single player, is a shame, especially when the franchise so far has basically been a long series of skill-based driving challenges. The just made it moments that this series has built itself on are really quite few and far between here. Which leads into a broader point about where this fits into the Driver franchise. It's a great game in isolation, and I hope that I've at least touched on why that is, but the elephant in the room, for me at least, is its enormous departure from what this series has been before it. If you pull the camera back, so to speak, there's a few more extrinsic different lenses that I want to look at Driver San Francisco through, so before we close this video, let's do that. Lens number 1, Driver San Francisco as a part of the Driver franchise. The short of it is, this probably didn't need to be a Driver game. It's pretty far removed from the aesthetics and goals of the franchise so far, and I do think about the alternate reality where this is the first game in an original series. Does it get a sequel, if it is? Does it even get made, if it is? Does it sell more or less than it did? Apparently, it didn't sell enough for Ubisoft to continue the series, but did they pigeonhole themselves by making it a part of a franchise with a then less than great reputation? These are all hypothetical, unanswerable questions that will always circle around in my head when thinking about Driver San Francisco, alongside a twang of disappointment that we never saw a more modern realization of those early Driver games. I don't think anything highlights the difference between San Francisco and previous driver games more succinctly than the ways they pay homage to old car chase films. Old driver games would basically do their best to be video game versions of the films they're inspired by. Driver 3 would take elements from Ronin and Heat to create its atmosphere and tell its story, as did Driver 2 with The French Connection, or Driver 1 with The Driver and Bullet. It was all about sort of trying to do the things that those films did, but in video game form. San Francisco, on the other hand, is more about celebrating old films by sending them up a bit. There's a series of side missions that all but say that they're directly referencing certain films. You have a Blues Brothers car chase, and a Dukes of Hazzard car chase, and a Bullet car chase, that sort of thing. They're all a blast. They're missions that you unlock using those movie token pickups, but unlike prior games, they do lean more towards parody. There's plenty of references elsewhere too. The first time you go 88 miles per hour in a DeLorean, you're thrown into a remake of the Driver 1 garage mission as a bit of a cutesy Easter egg throwback to the first game, mixed with a Back to the Future reference. It's very well done, and it's less about emulating these old films, and more about paying fan service to them, which gets at the core of Driver San Francisco's objective when compared to prior games. It's far more of a crowd pleaser, and a great one at that. It's no shock that this has become an internet darling, but it does muddle and dilute the identity of this franchise. I imagine Ubisoft had hoped that this would be the first of many in a sort of new, soft reboot era for Driver, but because it's the last Driver game, its legacy remains as the one that just isn't like any of the others. Lens number 2, Driver San Francisco as a Ubisoft game. So Atari pulls an Atari in 2006 and sells Driver to Ubisoft, and Ubisoft at the time were strategically trying to kick off some new franchises for the new generation of consoles. Assassin's Creed started in 2007, their first Far Cry game was in 2008. They tried and failed to turn Shaun White into the next Tony Hawk a couple of times, which is very amusing, and I think that San Francisco, being a relatively experimental game on that same gen of consoles, reflects the tail end of that era of Ubisoft. There's a great article on VG247 by Jeremy Peel that digs into why this was the end for Driver. I'll link it somewhere, and the gist of it is that Driver San Francisco just didn't sell enough, and so Watch Dogs was born out of its ashes in some way. The details about the development are a little murky and inconsistent, but it was easier to convince the higher-ups that Ubisoft could have its own GTA rather than another Driver game, which leads me to my final lens here. Lens number 3, Driver San Francisco as a part of the driving game genre. Arcade driving games were quickly losing steam, and there's a case to be made that San Francisco fell victim to the entire genre's downturn. At around the same time, Blur got strong reviews, didn't sell enough, and the developer shut down. Split Second got strong reviews, didn't sell enough, and the developer shut down. Burnout Paradise is an amazing video game, and we never saw another mainline Burnout game, nor did we see another Midnight Club after LA. MotorStorm's final release came out at around the same time too. I can keep going, but the point is, there were enough examples that major publishers scaled back their arcade driving game output from then on, and Driver San Francisco can now be looked at as a victim of that final major wave of AAA driving games failing. Genres go in and out of fashion, and it was clear that these just weren't the in thing anymore. There's something of an argument to be made that San Francisco almost could never have been a success, no matter how good a game it was, and considering how good a game it is, there has to be some truth to that. It didn't help that it released late in 2011 when a bunch of other big games were coming out. It had a relatively small marketing campaign, the remaining Driver fans like myself were skeptical about it, and it didn't have eye-catching graphics. It was almost destined to fly under the radar on release and subsequently become this beloved thing all these years later. It's funny, if it was more GTA-like some of the Driver games of old, maybe Ubisoft would have had more confidence in it, and Watch Dogs wouldn't exist. Who knows? I opened this video talking a bit about how annoyed I was that the developers were calling San Francisco a return to Driver's roots, and in a way that statement is still quite annoying, but When I think about what Driver 1 was and what it tried to be, its main goal was to be a fun, boundary-pushing homage to the on-screen car chases of old, and you can say the exact same thing about Driver San Francisco, even if it approaches everything in an entirely different way. Instead of pushing technical boundaries in the open world space, San Francisco pushes game design boundaries with the shift system. It's clearly not a return to Driver 1's structure, style, or design principles, but it is a return to its spirit and ambition, which is something the series had strayed away from with Parallel Lines. Normally in these retrospectives, I'd close with something like a neat summary of what the game is, or do my best to be at least a bit profound, which I know is very cheesy half the time, forgive me, but I haven't really had a strong thematic through line to this retrospective that I can draw upon now, and that was actually kind of intentional. Driver San Francisco demands to be talked about more casually. It's light, it's fun, it's disarming, and so I wanted to simply chat a bit about its legacy and why it's fun, light, and disarming in a bit of an attempt to match its tonal shift. So this time around, I'm going to close with a straight up recommendation that you go out and play this. I know many of you watching probably already have, but if not, go and track down a copy of Driver San Francisco and give it a whirl. Annoyingly, it's no longer on digital storefronts, but it runs on the new Xboxes if you can find a 360 copy, and it's easy to recommend without any hesitation or any caveats, which is something that I can't say about any other game in the franchise. Driver 3 may still be my personal favourite, 1 and 2 were more influential to games as a whole. I'll always be annoyed that the series never continued in the more self-serious and cinema-inspired direction of those original games, but Driver San Francisco still won me over, and I'm willing to wager that it'll win you over too. And there we wrap up the video. Thank you for watching. If you did, please just click like or leave a comment or, algorithm stuff. It helps. Or you can subscribe to me on Patreon from $1 a month where you get a bit of extra content and your name gets listed at the end of these videos. So those names will be coming up soon, and thank you. Yeah, that wraps up the Driver games. I started this in like 2019, or really I started it in 2015 when I reviewed Driver 3 the first time. But yeah, it's been a long road. More Driver content will keep coming. There's a Driver 2 GBA version. There's Driver San Francisco on Wii, which is like a weird prequel to the entire series, which I kind of want to talk about. There's Driver 76 on PSP, or maybe 78. I can't remember the name of it, but there's a PSP game that's basically the PSP version of Driver Parallel Lines. And then there's also Cop the Recruit on DS, which was once, I think, a version of Driver Parallel Lines as well. And there's some mobile games to talk about, and there's also Driver Speedboat Paradise, which we don't talk about. But there's a lot of Driver games that I want to cover, and I'm sort of thinking about ways to cover them, whether I do them individually or whether I package them all into one sort of these are the Driver spin-offs video. So yeah, if you're here for the Driver content, this isn't the end. There's also I think it's called Driver Syndicate, which is a fan game that I want to talk about. Yeah, I want to quickly thank VortexStory, who is a Driver 3 YouTuber, who's sort of helped me out a fair bit with these videos since the very start. A lot of the research and resources and video clips are from him, and he's just been an absolute champion, and I'll link his channel, and I think you should go check it out and subscribe to him. And yeah, thank you again to the patrons coming up on the screen. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.